This video is part of a series of videos on hermeneutics, the art and science of biblical interpretation. By me, I'm Dr. Joe Sprinkle. And today's video is on literary and theological context. An old hermeneutical adage reflects the importance of context. A text without a context becomes a pretext for a proof text. It's always important to interpret everything in context. One can even say that context is everything in interpretation. In order to interpret a passage or pericope rightly, one must see how it fits into the context of the book and how the book fits into the context of the Bible as a whole. Context comes from the Latin word meaning weaving together. Hence, it shows how things are related and connected. It shows that same words can mean very different things in different contexts. Now, we sometimes speak of the word pericope, and so let me mention the meaning of that word along the way. A pericope is a thought unit of scripture that makes reasonable sense when read by itself apart from its context. Examples of pericopes could be an episode in a larger narrative, a psalm or a psalm stanza, a portion of an epistle on one topic, and so on and so forth. But anyway, context will affect everything, both meaning and application. And because the same words can mean very different things in context, let me give you a little story that would illustrate that. There's a story from the days when the horse and buggy was still competing with the automobile as the mode of travel. And at that time, a farmer was on his buggy with his dog Spot on the seat next to him, being drawn by his horse Betsy. Unfortunately, his buggy was hit by an automobile driven by a man who was found to be at fault for the accident. The matter ended up in court where the driver of the buggy was suing the driver of the car. The driver of the car agreed to pay damages for the buggy and for the horse and the dog, both of whom died as a result of the accident. But he was contesting the claim that he needed to pay for the farmer's pain and suffering. And during the trial, the lawyer representing the driver of the car interrupted the farmer, saying, "Did you not say to the police officer who came to the scene of the accident, 'I'm okay'?" The lawyer pressed him for a yes or no answer, but the farmer refused to answer yes or no. Instead, he wanted to answer the question in terms of a story. And so he started telling a story, and repeatedly, the lawyer would stop him and demand, "Just answer the question, yes or no." And after several attempts, this led to an impasse and a meeting between the judge, the farmer, and the lawyers. And to much of the chagrin of the lawyer for the automobile driver, the judge decided to let the farmer answer the question by telling his story. "He's going to answer your question," said the judge. "He just wants to do so by telling his story." And this is what the farmer said. "Well, I was going around the bend in my buggy with my dog Spot and Betsy, my horse, when out of nowhere, wham, this automobile hits me. I flew out of the buggy and into the ditch, and it knocked me out for a while. I was pretty hidden by some tall grass. And when I came to, I saw a police officer had driven up, and the policeman saw my horse Betsy writhing in pain in the ditch. And he walked up to Betsy, pulled out his revolver, and put her out of her misery. And then he saw my dog Spot writhing in pain in the ditch. And so he walked up to Spot and pulled out his revolver again, and he shot poor Spot dead. And at that point, he finally noticed me, and he asked me, "Are you okay?" And I said, "I'm okay." Now, in that context, what does "I'm okay" mean? In that context, "I'm okay" means don't shoot me. Well, if we look at words in context, they often mean different things and what they might be taken to mean, taken out of context. For example, Philippians 4:13 has the line, "I can do all things through him who gives me strength." Now, taken out of its context, all things sounds like an unqualified universal statement, and not a few preachers have preached it that way. But logic alone suggests that it can't be so. Could Paul really do all things? Seems unlikely that Paul would be able to jump over the moon or turn sand into gold. And so when you look at it in context, you find that in the context, you need to read the verses before and after Philippians 4:13. The verses before it says, "But I rejoiced in the Lord greatly now that you at last revived your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned before, but you lacked opportunity. Not that I speak from want, for I've learned to be content in whatever circumstances I am. I know how to get along with humble means, and I also know how to live in prosperity. In any and every circumstance, I've learned the secret of being filled and going hungry, both of having abundance and of suffering need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. Nevertheless, you have done well to share with me in my affliction. You yourselves also know, Philippians, that the first preaching of the gospel after I left Macedonia, no church shared with me in the matter of giving and receiving, but you alone. For even in Thessalonica, you sent a gift more than once for my needs. Not that I need the gift itself, but I seek the profit which increases to your account. But I've received everything in full and have abundance. I am amply supplied, having received from Epaphroditus what you have sent, a fragrant aroma, an acceptable sacrifice, well-pleasing to God. Now, the context here suggests that Paul's statement is qualified. In verses 10 through 12, Paul is talking in context that in the midst of having plenty or having want, he can do all things. And then in the verses that follow, it basically says that he's grateful, however, for the gift that he had been given to allow him to do better and live with less want. Now, in context here, what all things of verse 13 is limited by what comes before. And what he's saying, in effect, is by saying I can do all things means that I can cope with contentment through Christ who gives me strength. Nonetheless, he was grateful for the gift that he had been given, as he goes on to say. Again, it's not a unqualified statement, I can do all things regardless of what those things might be. It is limited by its context. By the way, as you probably know, in political season, politicians love to quote the other side out of context so that they can give the wrong impression, or to edit videos in such a way that it leaves out the context or the circumstances in which words were said. Well, it's very important then that we should look for context. One of the implications of the need to read things in context is that it's important to read the Bible book by book, passage by passage before doing topical studies, because when you just grab verses out of context, if you're just searching a topic, it's very easy to take things out of their literary theological context. And so there's at least a priority, not that you can't do topical studies, but there's a priority in studying the Bible book by book, passage by passage in context before doing those topical studies. Otherwise, you may well reach false conclusions. So let me mention 6 questions for establishing literary theological context. First question, is it in the Old Testament or is it in the New Testament? And this is important, especially commands to Israel in the Old Testament may or may not apply to the New Testament Christian under the New Covenant, because there was a change of covenant, there was also a change of law, and not all the things promised to Israel are applicable to the New Testament church. A second question, at what specific point in the progress of Revelation is this passage? Even within the Old Testament, one must distinguish between several periods. Some divide up these periods into dispensations, others divide them up into major covenantal periods, but both dispensationalist theologians and covenant theologians, while they differ in their terminology, agree that there are different periods of time that form different theological contexts. And so if you are a covenant theologian, you will divide up the Bible into the period of time of the covenant of creation, which was broken at the fall in Genesis 3. Then you have the covenant with Noah. Then you have the covenant with Abraham. You have the Mosaic covenant. You have the Davidic covenant. And then finally, you have the new covenant, which will be followed by the eternal state in Revelation 21 and 22. Dispensationalists divide things up somewhat differently. They will talk about the period of innocence before the fall. They'll talk about the period of conscience up into the flood, period of human government after the flood, the promise in Genesis 12, the law to Moses, the church age at the coming of Christ, and then the kingdom age, which comes at the end of the age. But it makes a difference in which time period, under which of these covenants or under which of these dispensations a biblical statement is made, because that could affect how to understand and apply it. A third question that one can ask, what is the overall purpose of the particular book of the Bible that your verse is in? A book sometimes clearly states its overall purpose. So, for example, in John's Gospel, it says its purpose in John chapter 20 and verse 31, that he wrote this book that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. Sometimes the purpose of the book may not be stated explicitly as it is in John 20 and verse 31, but it can be deduced from what is said in the book. So the book of Job never exactly says what its purpose is, but based on the content of the book, it seems to have been written to deal with the question of why the innocent suffer and how one is to respond when you're innocent and you do suffer. Sometimes the book's purpose is not clear, or there are multiple purposes for it. Just because we can't always answer that question doesn't mean that it isn't a good question to ask. So that's a third question. What's the overall purpose of this particular book in the Bible? A fourth question, what is the structure or the organization of the book in which your passage is found? And how does your passage fit into it? For example, if you're studying the book of Ephesians, you can divide up Ephesians into chapters 1 through 3, which is primarily doctrinal, the theology of salvation. But then starting in chapter 4, verses 4 through 6, it gives practical implications. By the way, connected by that little connecting word, therefore, that we talked about in a previous video. And so it gives implications of how to live in the light of those doctrines. For any section of the first 3 chapters of Ephesians, one should ask, how does this contribute to Paul's doctrinal presentation of salvation? And for any section of the last 3 chapters, one can ask, how does this section contribute to Paul's presentation of how Christians ought to live the Christian life in the light of the doctrine that we have received? And that's how you can analyze a book structurally, or at least one example of it. A fifth question, what do the passages immediately before and immediately after your passage say, and how does your passage fit in between them? Now, in raising this question, there are differences between books as to how relevant this question is. Certain books are very tightly argued. The book of Hebrews is tightly argued. The book of Romans is tightly argued, so that each passage seems to flow into the overall flow of an argument. And so it's very important to understand the flow of thought as you study any particular passage. On the other hand, other books of the Bible show loose flow of thought. For example, Proverbs, you have a proverb about this and a proverb about that and a proverb about something else, and they don't necessarily hang together. Some sections do. You have a number of proverbs on a similar topic together, but sometimes they don't. You have the same problem with Ecclesiastes to a lesser degree, and also with the book of James. A passage here may have little to do with the passages before and after, but it's at least worth asking the question, why, how does it fit into the flow of thought of the passages before and the passages afterwards? And then 6, what is the internal structure of your passage? In other words, how would you outline it? How is it organized? If you're looking at Genesis 1, you'd say, oh, well, those are 6 days of creation. But then you can do a little more study and you can see, oh, that the first 3 days are days of separation, separating light from darkness, separating the waters above from the waters below, separating the dry land from the seas, followed by days of filling, where the heavens are filled with the sun and the moon and the stars on day 4, and the waters above, in the area below the waters above, you have flying creatures, and in the waters below, you have swimming creatures, and then you have land animals on day 6. And so 3 days of separation followed by 3 days of filling. And that's the organizational pattern of Genesis chapter 1. Or if you were looking at Psalm 2, well, you can divide it up into stanzas, 4 stanzas, each of which refer to God and the human Davidic king. So the nations rebel against the Lord and his anointed. They rebel against God and his king. But God mocks the nations. And as for me, I've chosen my king on Zion, my holy mountain. And then 7 through 9, the king announces God's adoption and God's kingdom. Again, God and the king. And then finally, verses 10 through 12, the nations are called to submit to God and his king. And so you have 4 stanzas, each of which refer to God and the king. And so any passage you're looking at, you can look at the internal structure and see how it's organized. Let me illustrate this approach by looking at the 10 Commandments, which is Exodus 20, verses 1 through 17. That's at least the first version of the 10 Commandments. There's another in the book of Deuteronomy. And you have to ask the question, well, is this Old Testament or New Testament? That's our first question. And well, obviously, the answer to that question is that it is in the Old Testament. And that affects how we apply it. The fourth commandment is remember the Sabbath and to keep it holy. The Sabbath in that context referred to the seventh day of the week, which started at sundown and went to the next sundown, Saturday, starting on Saturday evening. And so that was the Sabbath day. Well, we don't keep the Sabbath in quite the same way Israel does under the new covenant. And so in that regard, that particular commandment, which by the way is the only one not repeated in the New Testament at some point or another, is not as directly applicable as the other 9. Though even there we can learn about, giving time to God, setting aside time for God and setting aside time for rest and recuperation. But then the next question, well, under where are we at in the progress of Revelation? Well, this is the beginning of the Mosaic covenant or the beginning of the dispensation of law. And so that's where we place it. It's right the starting point of those two things. Third question, what's the purpose of the book of Exodus? Well, the book of Exodus doesn't precisely tell you its purpose, but it's easy to deduce it from the story that's given. It tells the story of how God redeemed Israel from Egypt and established a covenant with Israel as a nation. So apparently the purpose is to tell the story of God's redemption of Israel from Egypt and establishing a covenant relationship with Israel at Mount Sinai. And the Decalogue, 10 Commandments, actually relates to those themes. The prologue of the Decalogue says, I am the Lord your God who brought you forth out of the land of Egypt, which is the first half of that particular book. And of course, the commands of the Decalogue are part of that covenantal relationship that God was establishing between himself and his people, that they were to keep these particular commands. Well, what's the structure of the book of Exodus that the 10 Commandments are found in? Well, in Exodus 1 through 18, it tells the story of the deliverance from Egypt. Chapters 19 through 40 is the covenant at Sinai. And chapter 20, which has the 10 Commandments, is a part of that making of the covenant at Sinai. Indeed, Exodus 21 through 17 shows how laws were given as part of establishing a covenant relationship with God. They weren't done first. You had to keep the law and then we'd establish a relationship. God established the relationship first, but in that relationship, he expected his people to live according to his instructions. And then the next question, well, how does the 10 Commandments fit into the immediate context? And one could see a chiastic structure in the whole section of Exodus 19 through Exodus 24. It begins with a narrative of how the covenant was offered to Israel on Mount Sinai, and God appeared on the mountain in a rather scary kind of visible way. But then it goes to laws, the 10 Commandments or the Decalogue in Exodus 20, 1 through 17, I should say. And then it has narrative about fear of the Lord, not to be terrified, but to have that fear, respect for God that causes you to turn away from sin and obey his commandments. And then it gives some further laws, which have come to be called the Book of the Covenant in Exodus 20:22 through 23:33. And then it goes back to a narrative where the covenant is accepted. And so you have narrative, laws, and the narrative in an ABC, CBA kind of pattern. And where you have that kind of a pattern, usually the things that are most important are either the things at the beginning and end or the thing in the middle. The thing at the middle is fear of God, which is the attitude of heart that will cause you to obey God's covenant. And then on the outside is the covenant offered and the covenant accepted. The most important thing is the covenant. The laws are kind of subordinate to the covenant. And so this represents, you might say, the minimum requirements that God expects of a people who are in covenant relationship with them, that they're not to worship other gods, or not to take his name in vain, they're to remember the Sabbath, they are not to, murder and kill each other. They're going to honor their father and mother, and so on and so forth. Those are minimum moral requirements and spiritual requirements for people who are called by God's name. But then you get the internal structure of Exodus 21 through 17. Commandments 1 through 4 are commandments that relate directly to God. Don't have any other gods, don't make any images of God, don't take God's name in vain, remember the Sabbath. Those all relate to God more directly. But then commandments 5 through 10 relate to other human beings. Honor your father and mother, don't commit murder or adultery or theft or false testimony, and do not covet what belongs to your neighbor. First part, how we relate to God. Second part, how we relate to other human beings. And that's the kind of thing that one can do in analyzing a passage of that sort. So it's important to ask certain questions that will help us to determine the literary and theological context. Is it in the Old Testament or is it in the New Testament? At what stage in the progress of Revelation is it written? What's the overall purpose of your book? Does your passage fit into the thought structure and outline of your book? And if so, how? And what do the passages immediately before and after your passage, how does it fit into that? And how is your passage structured internally? Those are questions that will allow you to determine the literary and theological context of any passage. And my name is Dr. Joe Sprinkle.